Hey Wildcats, welcome back to the STEM Lab. In previous experiments, we discussed changes of states of matter and we added heat to ice to change it from a solid to a liquid, so ice into water, and then we cooled down the water to change it from a liquid to a solid, water to ice. Today, we're going to do very similar experiments, except this time we're going to use butter. So, do you think the butter will change from a solid to a liquid by adding heat, just like the ice did? Let's find out. We will start by talking about some properties of the butter. The stick of butter is a solid. I can pick it up, turn it around, it retains its shape. And the shape of this butter is a rectangular prism. Now we need to find the mass of the butter. So I'm going to be adding it to this glass container. So let's find the mass of this first. Okay, to find the mass, we will use the triple beam balance again. So this feels pretty heavy, so I'm going to start at 300, 400. Okay, 400 is too much, so the mass of the container is going to be 300 and something. All right, so the 40 made it go down too far, so we're going to back up to the 30. So the mass will be 330 something grams. So now I'll start sliding this one. Oh, I bumped it and that's a little too far. Almost. All right, we'll put it on the 2 and it is balanced. So the mass of the glass container is 332 grams. I have now unwrapped the stick of butter and put it in the glass container. So now we need to find total mass. I'm going to move this one starting to the 400. All right, and so that's too light. 500 is too heavy. So we'll go back to 400 and let's start at 30, too light. 40, too light. 50 is too heavy. So we're at 440. All right, and it is nice and balanced. So 442 grams is the total mass. All right, I subtracted the mass of the glass container, 332 grams, from the total mass, 442 grams, and I determined that the butter is 110 grams. Now let's add heat. Just like we did with the ice, I'm going to use the hot plate to add heat to the butter. Now remember, don't ever use a hot plate without adult supervision. Safety first. So now let's watch what happens. The butter has been on the hot plate now for 3 minutes, and you can see that as the heat has been applied to the butter, it's starting to melt. So now let's watch and see what happens next. The butter has now been on for 3 additional minutes, so 6 minutes total. I want to show a closer view of how it looks. So we still have some solid butter, but you definitely see the butter is melting. There's a lot of melted butter around the piece that's still solid. So let's go back to watching and see what happens. The butter has been heating now for almost 10 minutes. So somewhere between 9 and 10. And the stick of butter has gotten smaller, but it's still not completely gone. Hopefully just a little while longer.
A few moments later, more moments later.
The stick of butter has completely melted. It is now completely liquid. And let's look at the properties of the butter now. The shape of the butter is now the shape of the container, since liquids take the shape of their containers. And now let's check the mass. I've got the balance set on 440 grams now, since it was 442 grams when it was liquid. And it just balanced on 441 grams. So the mass is almost the same. It did lose a gram, and that very well may be from me stirring it just a minute ago. But the mass is relatively unchanged, just 1 gram off. The new total mass is 441 grams, and if I subtract the 332 grams, that's the mass of the container, I now know that the new mass of the butter is 109 grams. Now let's take the butter down to the freezer to cool it and see if it changes back into a solid. All right, I'm now gonna put the container of butter right here on the door of the freezer, just like I did with the water yesterday, and we will check back later.
1 hour later.
All right, I've taken the butter out of the freezer so we could get a closer look, and it looks pretty solid, but if I touch it, it's still pretty soft in the middle. So I'm gonna put it back in and we'll check it later.
1 hour later.
All right, our butter is now a solid again. When we started the experiment, the solid butter was in the shape of a rectangular prism. Now though, the solid butter is in a different shape. Like with the water, when we put the liquid butter in the freezer, it had taken the shape of the container. So as the butter cooled and became solid again, it remained the same shape of the container. Now let's find the mass. Since our total mass from when the butter was a liquid was 441 grams, I'm starting the balance on 440, and I'll start sliding the single gram. So there's 441, but we're not balanced because it's still a little bit too light. So let me go to 442, which is what we had started with in the first place. Now that's just a tiny bit too heavy, so I'm gonna back up just a little. And now it's balanced, and that is 441 3/4 grams. Let's compare the change in mass from the change of state from liquid to solid. So the total mass of the container plus the butter is 441 3/4 grams. So subtracting 332 grams from that, I end up with the mass of the butter being 109 3/4 grams. So if you remember, when we originally had the solid butter, we were at 442 grams, and so the butter was 110 grams. So we've almost come back to that original mass. And even though there is a slight change, there was a slight change going from solid to liquid and liquid to solid, our mass pretty much is unchanged. It's very, very little difference. I want to go back and revisit the shape of the butter. Now I've taken the butter out of the container so that we could get a closer look at its shape. I wasn't able to do this with the ice because it's a lot harder than butter, and I probably would have broken the beaker by trying to get it out. So if we look, so it's still in the same shape. It was in there like this, and so I've turned it over. So we can take it out, move it around. It's still a solid. There is this little bit of liquid here on the top. Now the reason there's this little bit of liquid on there is because when we melted the butter in the first place, some of the components broke down and separated into fat, water, and milk solids. And so once we freeze it back, some of those components are still a little bit separated. But for the most part, it is just as solid as it was when we began, just in a completely different shape. Thank you for joining me as we explored a little more about changes of states of matter. I'll see you next time. Bye.